we started looking at Kafka's The Trial last week, and the plan is to continue with that and possibly complete that today. But, on reviewing that, I said something in the episode last week suggesting that it had been a mistake to consider Kafka's books impenetrable and hard to read, and I said that in fact the language was quite straightforward and the events were quite commonplace, and then when using complicated undefinable terms. And that's true, but I think on reflecting further, I think perhaps what I said wasn't quite so. I mean, they are difficult to read, and it does take quite a lot of effort, and it's hard to get through them. But it's true that the language is simple, so they're not full of scientific, specialised terms, philosophical terms that you have to have studied a particular subject in to understand even the words that are used. They are straightforward words in normal language and dealing with outwardly commonplace events. The difficulty, though, is that the people in the books use those events and try to understand them and use the language to go down long, extensive avenues where they're trying to justify themselves or trying to understand their own motives or other people's motives. For everything that happens, the people seem to be trying to say, well, what does that really mean? What is that person really saying? What is their intention? How does that affect me? How does that affect my prospects and my outcomes? And what I'm saying, what I'm doing, what does that really mean? How is that going to affect these other people? Is that going to make them more likely to help me or more likely to oppose me? Is it going to advance my case? So there's these very intense, prolonged, almost obsessive patterns of thinking and trying to analyse things. And so that's what makes it so difficult, but the story's not really moving ahead, but these mental processes are taking place in the minds of the people and the author, I suppose, and never seem to get to an end point and never seem to find an answer. So that's why they are difficult to read, and that's why possibly people have dumped it all into that existentialist in inverted commas box, because it's just hard to understand and doesn't seem to get to a clear conclusion. Anyway, so having said that, so I guess we admit that they are difficult to read. The other point we were making last week, one of the points we were making was that particularly in all of Kafka's novels, there seem to be these episodes where the protagonist suddenly finds himself almost immediately in an intense relationship with a woman. And we thought, well, that may just reflect something that's going on in his mind rather than the reality. But what I forgot to mention is that apart from all these ones that happen suddenly and spontaneously, there's one relationship with a woman which is much more complex in the sense that it doesn't really get anywhere. And early in the trial, the protagonist, Joseph K, kind of makes an advance towards a young woman who's a fellow lodger in the establishment where he lives, and is rebuffed by her. And then right towards the end of the novel, he feels obliged to really apologise to her and confess that he acted wrongly in doing that. It's quite the opposite of all these other episodes that have happened where suddenly a woman and he are just flung together, and this happens in other novels as well, without any explanation or any second thoughts. In that case, he had made advances to this woman. She was offended and even shocked and rejected him, and then later on he feels the need to deeply repent, I suppose, and apologise for that. And that may have some bearing on the main part of the novel, which we haven't even got to yet, which is the fact of his trial and supposedly his guilt of something. But just before getting to that, we mentioned the protagonist is called Joseph K. In the castle, the other one we're going to look at soon, the protagonist there is called K. Kafka, of course, starts with a K. I mean, I'm not sure if we're supposed to draw any conclusions from that. But interestingly, the castle was actually originally written as a first-person narrative. So it said, I arrived at this village, I met this person. Later on that was changed to say K arrived at the village, K met this person. So anyway, one can make of that what one will, I suppose. Maybe it's just the difficulty of the names, but just in thinking of that too, there was this Hollywood personality of a former age called Danny Kaye, a singer, comedian, actor. I think he was Polish and he had some complicated name beginning with K, which was considered probably far too difficult for an Anglo-Saxon audience to be able to cope with, so it was abbreviated to K, but in that case it was spelled out as a word, K-A-Y-E, whereas in the Kafka novels the character is known as K, which is just a capital K with a full stop. So the novel, The Trial, begins with Joseph K in his lodgings being confronted by two men who have arrived to arrest him. They don't, or they're not able to, or won't tell him on what charges, and he never really finds out at any stage what they are, but he is under arrest and he needs to present himself for trial, and they give him the date and time when that's going to happen. Even though he's under arrest, he's free to move. He's not going to be taken to prison. He's free to move about as much as he likes. The people who've come to arrest him are kind of presented as rather loutish and rude and almost simpletons in some ways. So Kay is presented with this situation where he's apparently under arrest. He's been charged with something he doesn't know what. He doesn't know how he's going to defend himself. He doesn't know what he has to defend himself against. He just knows that he has to present himself on a certain date to this address that has been given. But in the meantime, supposedly, he can just carry on his life, as difficult as that may seem under the circumstances. And then subsequently he does present himself to that address, and we mentioned, I think in the earlier episode, that there's something really dreamlike and almost phantasmagoric about that, in that it's just a normal building in a normal street with all sorts of other commonplace things happening in it. It doesn't appear to be a legal institution or a court. It doesn't look like that at all. Ultimately he finds himself into the place that is the court. But the whole thing is sort of comically preposterous. So Kay eventually arrives at the court, still not knowing what he's being charged with, what his defence would need to be. At one stage he makes a speech, quite an impressive speech, which is very witty and learned and eloquent, and he talks about he even brings up matters such as the incompetence of court officials and the possible corruptibility of even judges and lawyers and court officials, and makes rather scathing, witty comments about that, and then speaks quite passionately about the right of the individual to a fair trial and to be able to defend himself, to know of what he's accused, and to be able to bring his case plainly and be presented and be presumed innocent, until all these noble principles. And so he speaks very well and very eloquently, and all the people in the courtroom applaud him and really enjoy his speech and laugh at the right moments when he's saying something clever and witty, and then regard it as a really excellent speech, and they congratulate him afterwards. But then one of them says to him, well, we really enjoyed that. Of course it has no bearing on your case. It makes no difference whatsoever to anything that's going to happen, but nevertheless we enjoyed listening to it. We mentioned last week that later in the novel Joseph K has to see a very important lawyer that he's got in touch with through friends, who is apparently going to really help him very significantly in his case. He goes there and meets the lawyer, who's actually in bed at the time, and quite often, a surprising thing in a number of Kafka novels, important conversations take place between someone who's lying in bed in a room and the other person who's just sitting in a chair in the room beside them. I'm not sure what that means, but anyway, but even during that consultation, Joseph K is drawn away by the sound of the servant girl in the next room, and immediately walks out of this room where he's having this critical legal discussion that his whole future might hinge on, to go and sort of follow his affair with the servant girl. So what does all that mean? So the basic proposition is apparently he's guilty of something, or someone says he's guilty of something. He doesn't really deny that. He would like to know what it is he's being accused of, but even though he's not given that information, nevertheless he doesn't reject the idea out of hand. He sort of accepts that it must be so, and that he needs to try and do something to resolve the situation or to avoid any bad consequences for himself. He makes some sort of attempts, but he only is half-hearted in his attempts. And we mentioned his speech that he made in the court. So some people have regarded Kafka's novels as being kind of political and put them in the same class, almost like George Orwell's 1984, that they're describing a totalitarian dictatorship of the kind that we know was so prevalent in the 20th century, and that Kafka's books fall into that same grouping with George Orwell. And there was another writer called Arthur Koestler, I think it was Arthur Koestler, who was, I'm not sure if he was Hungarian, I think, or maybe German, but he wrote books describing, kind of fictionally describing some of the show trials that took place in Moscow, about which, when the Bolsheviks turned on each other and then brought each other up for trial on ridiculous charges, which it was determined from the outset they were going to be guilty, and they were going to be punished and executed, whatever, no matter what defence they mounted against them. So some people put him in that category. To my mind, I don't think that is true. I mean, for one thing, as we mentioned before, he died in 1924, so admittedly the First World War had already happened then, the Bolshevik Revolution had happened, and Leninism, Stalinism was beginning, although Stalin's reign hadn't begun. I don't know how much Kafka would have been aware of that. I mean, a lot of the totalitarian Soviet Union form of government it probably was in existence already, but most people didn't really know about it already. But I just don't think Kafka's really talking about that sort of thing anyway. And I don't think they're political books at all, really. And as we'll see a bit later if we have time this week or maybe next week, to my mind, there are large kind of religious components to them. So I don't think The Trial or The Castle are really like 1984. 1984 is quite a very Animal Farm. George Orwell's books are quite clearly depictions of the history of the Soviet Union and the kind of society that the Soviet Union developed into, and the sort of society that we are now developing into in Western countries now as well. And so 1984, I think, is a very clear picture of what happened in Russia, and a very clear picture of what is developing now in England and Australia and the United States and Western Europe, and where it's probably going to develop even more into a clear demonstration of that in time. But I don't really think that's what Kafka is talking about. Maybe on some level, at a kind of a spiritual level, that's the case, but not so much in the outward political and economic forms. Anyway, so I'm going to run out of time in this episode, so I'll have to develop that idea a bit more next week with concluding some of the other elements of The Trial.